Picture this. It's November 13th, 1326. You're standing ankle-deep in the mud outside Hereford, staring upward. 50 feet above you, so high it required special scaffolding and engineers, Hugh Despenser the Younger is being taken apart while still alive. This isn't a routine execution. It's a public dissection. The executioner slices off Despenser's genitals and burns them in front of his eyes while he's conscious. The message is unmistakable. These are the parts of him that corrupted the king and violated the realm. And watching from the front row, cold, unmoving, and utterly satisfied, stands Queen Isabella of France. She doesn't flinch. She doesn't look away. While other queens prayed for mercy, Isabella designed revenge. How does a 12-year-old girl, traded like a treaty clause, become the only woman in English history to violently overthrow her own husband? To understand the hate burning in that muddy field, we have to rewind to where it all began. The year is 1308. Isabella is 12 years old. She walks down the aisle of Boulogne Cathedral, wrapped in silk and expectation, believing she's about to become the center of Edward II's universe. She's wrong. Completely wrong. Edward doesn't look at her. His eyes are fixed on Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight with a sharp wit, dangerous charm, and ambitions far larger than his rank. The humiliation starts immediately. At the coronation feast, Edward shatters protocol. He removes the tapestries bearing Isabella's royal arms and replaces them with Gaveston's. He takes the jewels from Isabella's dowry and drapes them around Gaveston's neck. He gives Gaveston the seat of honor and leaves his new child bride pushed into the shadows, watching her marriage dissolve in public. This isn't just a love affair. It's political self-sabotage. Edward inherited the crown from his father, Edward Longshanks, a king who crushed rebellions and ruled through fear. But Edward inherited none of his father's steel. Where Longshanks dominated, Edward indulged. He didn't want to rule England. He wanted companionship, affirmation, favorites. And in medieval politics, favoritism was poison. It destabilized the hierarchy. It enraged the barons. It invited rebellion. Isabella learned her first lesson quickly. Survival meant silence. For years, she played her assigned role, the obedient peace weaver. She smoothed over disputes between her husband and the furious nobility. She bore him 4 children, securing the succession while swallowing humiliation after humiliation. Outwardly, she was the perfect queen, measured, diplomatic, compliant. Inwardly, resentment fermented. The barons, unlike Isabella, ran out of patience. In 1312, they snapped. Piers Gaveston was hunted down like an animal. On Blacklow Hill, they ran him through with swords and hacked off his head. No trial, no mercy. Isabella likely felt relief. The rival was gone. The marriage might finally begin. And for a moment, it did. Edward and Isabella traveled together. They hunted. They appeared united. The barons relaxed, believing the king had learned his lesson, that favoritism ends in blood. They were catastrophically wrong. Edward didn't grieve Gaveston. He replaced him, and into that open door stepped Hugh Despenser the Younger. If Gaveston had been a reckless peacock, Despenser was a predator. He didn't just want affection, he wanted control. He studied Gaveston's mistakes and corrected them. He monopolized access to the king. No one spoke to Edward without Despenser present. No document was signed without his approval. The court slowly transformed into Despenser's private hunting ground. Isabella recognized the signs instantly. The whispers, the vanished funds, the way Edward's warmth toward her froze. But Despenser was far more dangerous than his predecessor. Gaveston humiliated the barons. Despenser destroyed them. And to survive, Despenser understood one thing clearly. The Queen had to be neutralized. Hugh Despenser didn't rule England, he stripped it. Where Gaveston flaunted jewels, Despenser seized land. He unleashed a campaign of legalized theft, so brutal it terrified even hardened nobles. Take the case of Lady Barrett, a wealthy widow with ancestral estates Despenser wanted. When she refused to surrender them, he didn't summon her to court. He sent men to her home. They broke her arms and legs, shattered her bones, and forced her, half-conscious with pain, to sign away her lands. This was the new law. Give Despenser what he wants, or he'll take it from your body. Edward either didn't see this, or chose not to. Drunk on Despenser's devotion, he showered him with titles, gold, and absolute protection. Anyone who complained was branded a traitor. Despenser became untouchable. Isabella was trapped in a court that felt more like a cage. She watched the nobility tremble. She watched the treasury bleed. But the real danger arrived in 1324, and it came from her bloodline. War broke out between England and France. The War of Saint-Sardos. Isabella was the sister of the French king, Charles IV. Overnight, her lineage turned her from queen into suspect. Despenser seized the moment. He whispered poison into Edward's ear. "How can you trust a French woman while we're at war with France?" Edward acted without hesitation. He declared his own wife an enemy alien. Her lands were confiscated. Her income vanished. Her French servants were expelled. The Queen of England became penniless and alone, surrounded by Despenser's spies. But Despenser wasn't finished. Money and isolation weren't enough. He went for her children. Late in 1324, Isabella's children were taken from her care and placed with Eleanor de Clare, Despenser's wife. The message was unmistakable. He controlled her husband. He controlled her wealth. Now he controlled her flesh and blood. Most women would have broken. Isabella didn't. Silence fell over her chambers, but it wasn't surrender. It was calculation. She needed an exit that didn't look like escape, and fate, with its cruel sense of irony, was about to hand her the perfect one. By 1325, England was rotting from the inside. The war with France was going badly, the treasury was drained, and Edward II was panicking. He needed a miracle, someone who could speak to the French king not as an enemy, but as family. The solution was painfully obvious. The only person capable of negotiating peace was the very woman he had stripped of power. Isabella made her move carefully. She approached Edward and Hugh Despenser with a proposal so reasonable, so dutiful, they didn't see the blade hidden inside it. She would travel to Paris and negotiate directly with her brother, King Charles IV. To Despenser, this looked perfect. If Isabella failed, she'd take the blame. If she succeeded, he'd keep the territory. Either way, she'd be gone, out of England and out of his way. It was the greatest mistake they would ever make. In March 1325, Isabella boarded a ship for France. As the white cliffs of Dover vanished into the fog, the weight that had crushed her for years finally lifted. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, she was not watched, not impoverished, not powerless. She wasn't a prisoner anymore. She was a Capet princess returning home. In Paris, Isabella performed flawlessly. She negotiated a treaty that required Edward to personally come to France and pay homage for his lands in Gascony. But Edward refused. He was terrified to leave England, convinced the barons would rise up and slaughter Despenser the moment his back was turned. Isabella anticipated this. she offered a compromise. Their son, Prince Edward, could come in his place. The heir would pay homage instead. Edward and Despencer agreed instantly. Desperate to avoid travel, they placed the future King of England on a ship and sent him straight into Isabella's arms. Now she had everything. She had freedom, she had French protection, and she had the prince, the living future of England. When Edward sent letters demanding her return, Isabella ignored them. Instead, she stood before the French court and made her declaration. She would not return to England while Hugh Despencer stood between her and her husband. Marriage, she said, was a union of two, not three. She framed herself not as a rebel, but as a loyal wife forced into exile by a corrupt favorite who had destroyed her marriage. Edward was stunned. He appealed to the Pope, claiming Isabella had been bewitched. He demanded Charles send her home. Charles refused. The Queen, he said, had come of her own free will, and as his sister, she would not be forced. Isabella was safe, but safety wasn't enough. She had no army, no money, and no way to remove Despencer. She needed a weapon, and in the shadows of Paris, she found one. Roger Mortimer was already there, an outlaw, an exile, a fugitive with a death sentence hanging over his head. He was everything Edward II wasn't: decisive, brutal, dangerous. Mortimer had led a rebellion against the Despensers years earlier. He had failed, been imprisoned in the Tower of London, and escaped in one of the most audacious prison breaks in English history, drugging guards, climbing through stone walls, and vanishing into the night. When Isabella arrived in France, the two found each other quickly. Both had been stripped of their lands. Both had been humiliated. What began as political necessity soon ignited into something far more explosive. A queen taking a lover wasn't scandal. It was treason. By crossing that line, Isabella destroyed any path back to Edward. There would be no forgiveness now, only victory or death. She made that break public. Isabella dressed exclusively in black, claiming she mourned a marriage murdered by Hugh Despencer. It was brilliant propaganda. Her adultery became martyrdom. Her rebellion became duty. But rage doesn't raise armies. Money does. France wouldn't fund an invasion. Charles sympathized, but he wouldn't risk war. Desperate, Isabella and Mortimer turned north, to Hainaut. Count William of Hainaut was pragmatic. He had ships, mercenaries, and 4 daughters. Isabella made her offer. She placed her son on the table. Prince Edward would marry William's daughter, Philippa of Hainaut. In exchange, the Count would provide ships, soldiers, and cash. It was a cold, transactional deal. Isabella was mortgaging her child's future to buy her revenge. The agreement was signed. The dowry was paid up front. Mercenaries assembled at the docks. The force was small, barely 1,500 men. Against the English crown, it was madness. They were gambling everything on one hope: that England hated the Despensers as much as they did. In September 1326, 96 ships set sail. Isabella stood on deck beside Mortimer and her son. She wasn't a queen seeking justice anymore. She was an invader. They landed on September 24th at the River Orwell in Suffolk. Wet, scattered, exhausted. If Edward's army had been waiting, it would have ended there. But the shore was empty. And then something extraordinary happened. As Isabella's army marched inland, men began emerging, not to fight, but to join. Local knights first, then nobles. Then the king's own half-brother, the Earl of Norfolk, rode into camp and pledged his army to the Queen. The regime didn't collapse. It evaporated. In London, Edward waited for support that never came. The people chose invasion over Despenser. Edward and Despenser fled west with the treasury, abandoning the capital. The city exploded. On October 15th, London descended into blood. Mobs hunted royal officials. Walter Stapledon, Bishop of Exeter, was dragged from his horse, beaten, and beheaded with a butcher's knife. His head was sent to Isabella. She was no longer reclaiming her throne. She was conquering England. Isabella advanced west with terrifying speed. Fortress after fortress collapsed without resistance. At Bristol, she captured Hugh Despenser the Elder, the father of the man who had destroyed her life. He was an old warrior, once respected, now useless. Isabella showed no mercy. He was hanged in his armor, left to rot on the gallows for 4 days before his body was cut down and thrown to the dogs. It was a message to his son. There would be no negotiation. Edward and Hugh Despenser the Younger were now fugitives, fleeing through the soaked hills of South Wales with dwindling supplies and no allies. Gold was useless. Loyalty was gone. On November 16th, 1326, they were cornered near Neath Abbey. The king surrendered without a fight. Despenser tried to starve himself, hoping to die before facing Isabella. She refused to allow it. He was force-fed. She wanted him alive. The procession into Hereford was deliberate humiliation. Despenser was strapped to a miserable horse, crowned with stinging nettles. Biblical verses condemning pride were written on his skin. Trumpets blared, not in honor, but in mockery. On November 24th, his trial began. Though trial is generous, he wasn't allowed to speak. The verdict was predetermined. The execution was ritualized symbolism. Dragged behind horses for betraying the realm, hanged but cut down alive for stealing the treasury, castrated for corrupting the king and violating the marriage bond. His genitals were burned in front of him while he screamed. His heart was torn out. His head was sent to London Bridge. His body was cut into 4 pieces and scattered across England. Isabella watched. With Despenser dead, one problem remained. Edward II still lived. Killing an anointed king was unthinkable. Letting him live was suicidal. So Isabella and Mortimer invented something new. In January 1327, Parliament gathered not to advise a king, but to remove one. Edward was accused not of evil, but of failure, losing Scotland, losing France, destroying the church, being incorrigible without hope of amendment. The people agreed. At Kenilworth Castle, Edward collapsed when told. He wept. He surrendered the crown. His 14-year-old son was crowned Edward III. Isabella ruled through him, but a living ex-king is a danger. Edward was moved to Berkeley Castle. Conditions worsened. When he refused to die naturally, a decision was made. On the night of September 21st, 1327, a scream echoed across the countryside. The next morning, Edward was dead. No marks. Officially, grief killed him. The legend said otherwise. A red-hot poker, a horn, murder without visible wounds. Whether true or not, the story stuck because people believed Isabella and Mortimer were capable of it. They ruled openly after that, greedily. Mortimer became everything Despenser had been, arrogant, untouchable, and Isabella didn't see the danger. Her son did. In October 1330, Edward III struck. Using a secret tunnel beneath Nottingham Castle, Mortimer's hole, he stormed his mother's chambers. Mortimer was arrested despite Isabella's desperate cries. "Fair son, have pity on the gentle Mortimer." There was no mercy. Mortimer was hanged like a thief, his body left to rot. Isabella lived. She wasn't executed. She was neutralized, stripped of power, confined to Castle Rising. She survived another 28 years, silent, wealthy, haunted. When she died in 1358, she was buried not in royal robes, but in her wedding dress. And placed on her chest was a small casket. Inside it, the heart of Edward II. Remorse, possession, guilt, love, or all of them at once. Isabella of France wasn't a monster born. She was made. And when history pushed her into a corner, she didn't disappear. She bit back,